This episode of The Energy Show is proudly sponsored by Sunlight and Power, the Bay Area's leading commercial and residential solar contractor. SLP has been designing and installing photovoltaic, battery backup, and solar thermal solutions since 1976. Help fight climate change. Go solar with Sunlight and Power today.
So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, I'm going to make a bold prediction. In 20 years, electricity will be too cheap to meter, almost free. And that electricity will come from nuclear power. Now, there's three implications of almost free electricity. First, electric vehicles are going to dominate road transportation. Gasoline demand will plummet. Second, heat pumps will dominate space heating and cooling. Natural gas demand is going to go down. And the third implication is it's really hard to make money when the product that you're selling is almost free to your customers. So the utility business model is going to collapse. Now, you've probably heard this prediction before. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission chairman Lewis Strauss said that his children and grandchildren would have power too cheap to meter. Now, he was referring to nuclear fission, and too cheap to be metered, implying the metering and the related payment costs are greater than the energy costs. You know, the meters that we have now, they're not free. By the way, PG&E spent over $3.2 billion on smart meters in California, plus ongoing maintenance. Now, the meters are expensive, even when everything's automated. Now, 70 years later, I'm making almost exactly the same prediction as Lewis Strauss at the Atomic Energy Commission. But I'm making this prediction on fusion power, with a fusion generator that's 93 miles away, not some of these new tokamak experimental fusion reactors that we've been trying to build for 60 years. This is the sun. And we're going to do this with dirt cheap rooftop solar panels on every building with a sunny roof. Now, from this graph, PV module prices gap down 50%. You can see how fast the solar prices are continuing to decline. And it's because they're a mass-produced product. They're cranking these up in millions of them right now. So you take those cheaper and cheaper solar panels and you combine them with inexpensive storage batteries in every building, in every car. And by the way, the battery prices are going to come down a lot also. I don't know if they're going to come down as quickly as solar panels, but we're seeing the same basic trend line for battery prices. Now, I'm just going to point out, being realistic, the hardware costs of solar panels and batteries will decline a lot. But when we look at the total installed system costs, the administrative costs, the paperwork, the permitting, everything else, and the installation costs, the installation labor, because the labor rates keep going up, those costs keep going up. So the decline isn't as dramatic and as fast as you'd expect to see just because the panels and the batteries will get cheaper. But those are still the main costs, and they're going to go down. So you probably think I'm crazy, and you're probably right. But stay tuned. Listen a little bit more to my logic. And this logic is based on realistic power plant costs and construction timelines. So I took a look at 4 potential types of power plants. And I looked at these over a 10-year installation horizon, because that's how fast we really need power for electric vehicles in the U.S., for all the heat pumps that we could conceivably install, and for whatever demands artificial intelligence may have. So the 4 kinds of power plants we're looking at are natural gas plants, traditional plants, turbines, wind turbines, utility solar coupled with storage, because these systems are now going in together just like we're putting them in homes and businesses, and rooftop solar and storage. Notice that I'm not including nuclear as an option. And the reason is It's taken over 20 years to install the last nuclear power plant. Every single power plant that's been contracted has gone over huge cost overruns. The last one, I think, was at least $7 billion over. And that's not even including the cost to decommission them, how many decades later. No utility is able or interested in taking the risk that they're going to be on the hook for a nuclear plant that's going to take 20 years to install, that historically goes over budget, and that may not really be competitive by the time it's installed. Okay, so now let's look at the costs of these power plants. Now, there's really big distinctions between utility solar and rooftop solar. Note that rooftop solar economies of scale are not as good as utility solar. And the reason is that you're putting in an 8 kilowatt system at a time instead of like a 10 megawatt system. So you don't have the economies of scale with rooftop solar. However, rooftop solar requires no transmission and distribution costs, whereas utility solar requires enormous transmission costs, by far and away more than the cost of the power plant themselves. And it takes forever to put those in. So now let's kind of drill down to all these different power plants, and more specifically. So let's look at natural gas power plant. You need equipment, you need all the parts, everything assembled, and you need the labor. You also need a site, you need a building, you need the turbines, you need some transmission and distribution infrastructure. Now, what's really interesting about natural gas, and bizarrely it applies to the recommissioning of some of the nuclear power plants like 3 Mile Island, is a lot of times these natural gas plants, they're built close to cities, like 3 Mile Island. It was built close to Harrisburg. So you don't need long-distance transmission lines, which could take 10 years or more to build. So they're cheaper. Now, also, you have every single one of these natural gas power plants, although the turbines are semi-mass produced, there's a lot of custom construction costs. Now, for wind power, you need, obviously, equipment. You need the parts and labor. You need a site, and the turbines themselves are kind of semi-mass produced. It's not every single thing is custom made like nuclear right now, but they're semi-mass produced. And you need, once again, very extensive transmission infrastructure, power lines that go from wherever these wind farms are to where the people are and the buildings are. And those are expensive. And it's the same with utility solar. Now, these transmission costs, they're extremely high. I'll just give you an example. PG&E is saying that their costs for transmission, they're trying to fix a lot of transmission, but it ranges from $3 to $4 million per mile if it's underground. It's still a lot if it's above ground, but they're talking about putting in transmission lines in PG&E territory for $3 or $4 million a mile. They like to put them underground because then there's no possibility of burning down cities. So once again, with wind equipment and a wind farm, you also need a lot of custom construction costs. Now let's coming back to this transmission issue, let's talk about utility solar. Now you obviously need, it's just basically a scaled up version of a home solar system. You need the solar panels, you need racking, you need parts, you need labors. The utility systems, most of them right now are built with trackers, so it gets a better energy harvest. And they work very reliably, and they really do improve the economics of the systems. On these utility solar farms, you need a site. As I mentioned before, you're using mass-produced solar panels. With these solar panels, we measure everything on a cost per watt basis. I'm seeing prices of 15 cents a watt, and I'm even seeing prices in Asia from the factory of less than 10 cents a watt. So, as I said, dirt cheap. You also need this extensive transmission infrastructure. You need these faraway sites. So the graph above shows what the transmission and distribution costs have been for PG&E's long-term transmission and distribution wiring. You can see that their costs have gone through the roof as they start to try to connect these distant power plants, mostly solar, also wind, not natural gas because they're building those close by. But these costs are really high. It's basically the wires and all the permitting work you need to get them. So looking at this graph from PG&E, the cost for transmission and distribution spending went from 9 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's kind of what was added to your bill, to 24 cents a kilowatt hour over the past decade. Okay, we're going to add up these numbers in a minute. And these transmission costs are getting worse fast because PG&E's got to now spend $3 or $4 million per mile for underground lines. So looking at it realistically, these solar power plant Construction costs, that's what you see these companies putting them in. They're not necessarily the utilities. A separate company will be the developer. They'll put in these beautiful solar power plants, 50 megawatts, whatever. 2 cents a watt. But that doesn't include the transmission and the distribution costs. When you look at adding everything up, I mean, you can just see it's what we pay on our electric bills, because most of PG&E's power is still brought in from distances. Mostly it's a combination of local solar, distributed solar, long-distance transmission, natural gas, hydro, etc. But the average cost in PG&E territory is 40 cents a kilowatt hour. So let's just use that number for the cost of solar, 40 cents a kilowatt hour when it's utility solar. Now let's look at rooftop solar. You don't need a site because it's already on the building, home or business. Once again, the solar panels are mass produced. You can get them in enormous quantity, but here's the distinction. Since an installer buys these panels, they're not getting them for 15 cents a watt. That's what you get if you're a utility solar developer and you're buying 10,000 panels. They're actually much more expensive, bought in smaller quantities, like 8 kilowatts a pop. So call it 40 cents a watt now. That's expensive, but 40 cents a watt. But these rooftop solar systems connect directly to the distribution grid. The distribution grid are those wires in your neighborhood. There are wires in companies and commercial buildings. So it's local. It's not those high tension, they call them high tension wires, towers with wires going kind of cross country. So with rooftop solar, we're able to avoid all of the transmission costs and most of the distribution costs. There's some talk about, hey, you need a few more switches or a few more controllers if lots and lots of people put in solar, but that's kind of in the noise. However, for rooftop solar, the construction costs are very high. You got a crew of 2 or 3 or 4 people. They're doing these one at a time, 8 kilowatts at a time. Much more expensive than if you put 10,000 panels together in a field. As a result, the lifetime costs for a residential or commercial solar power system, nothing too huge, it's about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Not too bad. So let's just compare these. If you were to put solar on the roof of your house, 10 cents a kilowatt hour, I'm sure in many cases it's much, much less. Whereas our average PG&E bill here in California, 40 cents a kilowatt hour. The ratio of rooftop solar costs to the customer, not what it costs to build a solar plant, but to the customer, 10 cents for rooftop, 40 cents for utility scale. That's why the power plant, these utility scale, and the wind plants are very, very expensive. Now let's look at this thing called operating expenses and actually who owns the system. So with natural gas, the biggest operating expense is you've got to buy methane. That's natural gas. And you have to buy this methane at the fluctuating world price, because the price of methane or natural gas is a worldwide commodity. So if the price goes up in Europe, the U.S. producers are not going to ship it in the U.S. cheaper. They're going to try and ship it to Europe where it's more expensive, just like other commodities like oil. So you've got this fluctuating price. We don't know what it's going to be next year. Even if our costs are low, the natural gas producers are going to make that price as high as possible so they can make the most money. And I understand that. They don't care about keeping the price low in the U.S. You also have ongoing power plant maintenance, of course, and also anytime this is sold through utility, you've got utility profits and investor profits. So there's a lot of overhead there. When the owner is the utility, that means the ratepayers, you and me, pay for all these costs via our electric bills. Now, let's look at a wind power plant. It's semi-manufactured, as I mentioned before. There's some ongoing maintenance, but you also need these long-distance transmission line construction, maintenance, and since they're basically the power is being provided via the utility, you've got utility expenses and overhead and investor profits. And once again, since the owner of these plants or the company that's kind of got to pay for everything is the utility, that means the ratepayers, you and me, pay for all the costs via our electric bills. Utility solar, basically the same situation. You're mass producing the panels with costs still coming down, very limited ongoing maintenance. But once again, we have long distance transmission lines, you've got maintenance, you've got utility overhead, and you've got investor profits. And once again, the owner is the utility, so that you and I, ratepayers, are paying for it via our electric bill. Rooftop solar, completely different model. Yes, we're still using these mass-produced panels with costs still coming down. But as I noted, the costs for an installer to get the panels is way more than from what the utility solar installer would pay. And the installation costs are higher because they're basically these home and business systems. They're installed by a guy, handing the panels up on a ladder to workers up on the roof. You're kind of putting them in one at a time, where it's very small scale. Where utility scale, they're doing, as I mentioned, 10,000 panels at once. But here's the big thing. There's zero long-distance transmission line costs. You don't have to pay for that. You don't have to maintain that. There's zero profits that have to go to the utility, and you don't have to worry about all the other investor issues. And to put a cherry on top of this, the owner of these systems is the home or the business. So there's no extra cost to ratepayers. It's better for everyone except for the utilities. So when you or I or a business decides to put solar on, they don't have to get permission from the Public Utilities Commission. They don't have to worry about anything. There's no other payments that have to be made. It's just done, and it's done quickly. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So now look at how fast these power plants can be built and put into service. This is becoming an absolute critical issue in California because it's really clear that as we electrify everything and we no longer drive gas vehicles, we need this power fast. We can't wait 10 years, and that's why nuclear, with a 20-year horizon, completely out of the question. So natural gas plants can get built faster than wind and utility solar because a lot of times the land is easier to get, the power plants are smaller, the design and the permitting is a lot easier. Since they can be constructed close to or in cities, there's no long-distance transmission lines required. That's the problem with wind and utility solar. It takes 10 years or more to get the land, get the permits, design the system, and dig up everything and install these long-distance transmission lines. And since they're remote from cities and towns, we're not talking about like a mile of these things. Sometimes there's hundreds of miles long, and we need them kind of all over the country. I mentioned before, PG&E is looking at costs of $3 to $4 million per mile plus maintenance. And this is kind of a surprise. I had a good friend who kind of pointed this thing out. Utilities are spending $3 to $4 million a mile for undergrounding lines, but they also get a 12% rate of return on these assets for 50 years. So when you think about it from a utility standpoint, wouldn't they much rather acquire power from a solar plant 500 miles away and then tell the government, oh, we got really cheap power, but oh, by the way, we've got to build these transmission lines that are going to cost $10 billion. They get a huge rate of return on that. That's the problem that we have with California. The utilities, they just want to get these things built. And it's okay for them to take 5 or 10 years to do that. And it's okay for them because there's going to be a shortage to raise prices for electricity because there's just much more demand than there is supply. So the profitability that utilities get on these remote solar farms and remote wind farms is probably the biggest contributor to their bottom line. So it's not surprising the utilities prefer these power plants since they're one of the most profitable businesses they have. Rooftop solar, it's not taking 10 years. It takes like 6 months, 3 months. Sometimes if things are kind of operating smoothly and it's a simple system, there's other places in the country where I'm sure you can get it for a month. And we've done them in as little as a month. Typically, it's more like 2 or 3 with all the paperwork. But so the installations are really fast. And also the costs are paid by the homeowner, by the business, not by all the other ratepayers. So rooftop solar systems, just kind of summarize, have 3 big advantages over utility solar. First, there's no transmission and distribution costs and the overhead costs, since we don't have to pay for the utility skyscrapers and the executive bonuses and all the other profits that the stockholders of the utility have, that those costs are way lower. Second, the costs for rooftop solar are borne by the building owner, the home, the business. There's no extra charge to ratepayers, and there's no maintenance that ratepayers have to pay in the future. And third, these rooftop solar systems can be installed very quickly with immediate benefits to homes and businesses compared to the 10 years or longer that it takes for remote power plants and transmission lines. So let's kind of take a step back and say, hey, if you're trying to reduce your electricity costs, you have 2 options. You can cut way back on your electricity usage. That's not really that practical anymore. It's getting hotter. We want to run our air conditioning. We're buying electric vehicles. It's really hard to use less electricity. The trend is much, much more. And so you can't cut back. Really, the only thing you can do is install rooftop solar and a battery. And that's why they're becoming so popular. Yes, they're somewhat expensive. Paybacks are 5 to 10 years in California, and there's lots and lots of financing available. Now, wrapping up now, let's talk about what almost free electricity means to you and me in society in the future. First, electric vehicles will rule road transportation. The demand for gasoline is going to plummet. Yes, there's going to be people that are still for 50 years going to want to buy gasoline, and it'll be available. And, I have a 25-year-old car, and I'm happy to still be able to get gasoline for it. And, 25 years from now, there's going to be a lot of people with still, they don't want to lose those cars, and cars have some value. The second, heat pumps, because they can be operated with electricity and they're cheaper and safer and better comfort. Heat pumps, without a doubt, are going to dominate space heating and cooling. And right now, that space heating is happening from natural gas in many places around the country. We're still getting the natural gas to generate electricity. So that's ultimately paying for the cooling too. So heat pumps are going to dominate, and that natural gas demand is going to plummet. The utility business model is going to collapse because it's really hard to continue to sell a product that your customers can get for almost free. And the way that customers are going to get that power for almost free is with more and more rooftop solar and battery systems. Okay, that's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. Thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And if you missed any of today's show, you can always go to the Energy Show website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.
This episode of The Energy Show was proudly sponsored by Sunlight and Power, the Bay Area's leading commercial and residential solar contractor. SLP has been designing and installing photovoltaic, battery backup, and solar thermal solutions since 1976. Help fight climate change. Go solar with Sunlight and Power today.